Hello.
Hey, Roberto. Okay, so um, I am going to skip over some of the material that I had originally planned to do. I feel we're pretty far behind in terms of what I wanted to cover in this class. So I'm going to skip over some of the stuff we had talked about in the four worlds model and the different souls, different levels of soul. And I'm going to go straight to segment number 7 in this class, which deals with magic, right? And the role of magic in Jewish mysticism. Now, I'm sure that you understand that many Jews believe that magic has nothing to do with Judaism. But we know that there are many practices that are rooted in magical beliefs. So, times of transition are fraught with anxiety. And so certain superstitious practices grew up around them. What's the biggest transformation? When a couple gets married, right? Or when a new life comes into being or passes from this world. So just, mentioning marriage, right? A number of customs relating to the wedding ceremony are based on the belief that they would protect the parties from some kind of harm. Now, the bride wears a veil. And the original purpose of that was to disguise her so that the demons that wanted to attack her couldn't recognize her. Demons are very dangerous. They're just not that smart. Right. So hence, and then a whole rationale was created, which, typically if I were performing a wedding and explaining the rituals to a young couple, I wouldn't tell them that the bride wears a veil because she's going to be protected from demons. I would, support the biblical practice of the lifting of a veil. Okay? Isaac and Rebecca in Scripture. Right? The bride in a traditional ceremony walks around the groom 7 times. Right? The original purpose for that? Well, first of all, 7 is a magic number, and by circling him 7 times, she creates a magic circle around him, which protects him from harm. The breaking of a glass at the conclusion of the ceremony was intended to scare away the demons, who at that moment, the status of the parties is changing, and that makes the bride especially vulnerable. Okay? Now, all of these practices have been reinterpreted, and again, we explain them to people in more rational terms. That doesn't change the fact that they entered Jewish life in much more primitive times and for much more primitive reasons. And these practices helped people feel that they had a certain degree of control over what was going on. And that was very important in times when people's status was changing, and thus people felt more vulnerable to harm. This relates to one of the forms of Jewish mysticism, which I've referred to in my classes and in my book as affective Kabbalah, not effective, but affective Kabbalah. The goal of normal Kabbalah is to fulfill God's need. The goal of affective Kabbalah is to fulfill our human needs. Sometimes we refer to it as white magic, right? It's not black magic. We're not trying to cause harm to anybody. We're trying to use magic for good purposes, hence the term white magic. Right? Now, the mystic differs from the magician a little bit because the mystic is committed to a religious approach and a view of the world beyond this world, which will support the goal that he is trying to accomplish. Right? And so some mystics were willing to use magic in order to achieve their goals. Now, in scripture, right, the Torah is very much against the use of sorcery, right? However, it never denies that magic could sometimes be effective, right? It just said, well, you can't do that, right? And so magic exists within the tradition. You have all these rituals that started out as magical practices, and then the meaning of it was transformed. And so mystics occasionally decided that they would try to alter reality through the use of magic in order to protect either their community or individuals from demons, from evil forces of one kind or another. Right? And until relatively modern times, even learned Jews believed in the existence of demons. Right? We may think of, certain demons as germs, right? And we know how to prevent germs in certain circles. We're looking at vaccines, right? But in a time when people didn't have the kind of medical knowledge that's available to us, they looked for other solutions to demons, right? Some of the early sages were considered to be very knowledgeable in the use of magic, using, for instance, different names of God in order to prevent harm from certain demons. There were prominent rabbis in the medieval period, among the Hasidei Ashkenaz, for instance, in the 12th, 13th centuries in Germany, Judah the Pious, Eliezer of Worms, and then later on in 16th century Tzvat, Isaac Luria and others. They were certainly aware of and definitely practiced certain magical rituals. The mystical view accepted the reality of the demonic and found ways to try, at least, to address it. Right? We have, hopefully more effective ways today, but they developed different types of magic to address different problems. So I'll give you just 4 different types of magic. The first one was curative, in order to heal some problem. And the problem was not necessarily a physical illness. It might be that, someone was possessed by a demon. So this is probably something in the psychological realm, right? So how do you perform an exorcism and get rid of the dybbuk? Right? That's one form of magic called curative, right? The second form was preventative, meaning trying to prevent different kinds of harm. A third kind of magic was creative, being able to bring about something new. So, for instance, you're all familiar with the myth of the golem, right? But, and we saw for those of you who were in this class last year, we talked about the role of the golem and how the rabbis created it for a variety of purposes to meet different needs within the community. So that's the creative kind of magic. And then the fourth kind was predictive, using magic in order to try to find out the future so that you could deal with the future more effectively. So we're going to look first at the at a segment from the Tanakh where the prophets were able to perform wonders. So here is the story of King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah. Okay? Hezekiah took ill, and the prophet says to him, get your affairs in order. You are going to die. Hezekiah prays, God, I've done the right stuff. I've been good. Right? And bring me some relief. Give me another chance. And so God goes to Isaiah, even before Isaiah goes out of the court, and says, go back and tell him, I'm going to heal you. I'm going to give you the means to do it. Isaiah said, get a cake of figs, and they got one, and they applied it to the rash, and he recovered. Right? Hezekiah asked him, what is the sign the Lord will heal me, and I shall go up to the house of the Lord on the third day? Right? And here's the sign. Right? Shall the shadow advance 10 steps or recede 10 steps? Hezekiah says, well, it's normal for it to lengthen 10 steps, but not for the shadow to recede. So Isaiah prays to God, and God made the shadow recede 10 steps. Right? That's it. Isaiah, who's a prophet is not necessarily someone who operates in magic. He's a moral authority, but he is also a healer. He's a wonder worker. That's part of what he does. Right? So, the sundial, as it were, goes backwards. Right? And that's the sign that this is working. Right? So, there was a historian who authored the book of Kings, and the prophet, according to this historian, the prophet can do this. He has the power to make this change. And other prophets also are given such power. Moses has this kind of power. Elijah has this power. Elisha has this power. They're able to perform certain magical deeds. Now, does being able to perform a miracle mean that you're a prophet? Not necessarily. No. Maimonides says it this way: says, how could the Creator seek help from what He has created? Right? That's not, it's not a proof. Right? But a great many people did believe that someone who had the role of prophet and who was accepted as a prophet could perform this kind of magic, could perform such miracles. The Talmudic rabbis, they're also seen as wonder workers, right? This is a really interesting text, right? Let's take a look at text number 2 here. Rabbah and Rabbi Zerah joined together in a Purim feast. Well, what do you do on Purim? You get drunk, right? It's a mitzvah to get drunk, so drunk that you can't tell the difference between blessed be Mordecai and cursed be Haman. Okay, that's pretty drunk. So what happens here? They got into some kind of dispute, and Rabbah arose and cut Rabbi Zerah's throat. The next day he prayed on his behalf after he sobered up and revived him. Next year, Purim comes along. Rabbah says, come on over. We'll have the Purim feast together again. Rabbi Zerah says, maybe not, because a miracle doesn't happen on every occasion. Right? I'm just lucky that it happened last time. Right? Now, one other little thing about this. It may be that the actual rabbinic pair is not Rabbah and Rabbi Zerah, but Rava and Rabbi Zerah. Rava is a different rabbi, right? But Rava and Rabbi Zerah are the ones in the Talmudic story that we saw last year about the creation of a golem, right? They were the ones in the story. Rava created the golem, sent it to Rabbi Zerah. Rabbi Zerah said, you came from Rava. Rava must have sent you, right? Go back to your dust. You don't belong here, right? So Rava, according to this story, if indeed it's Rava and not Rabbah, he might be, a big problem when he's under the influence, right? But he has magical powers, not only the curative powers described in this text, but also the creative powers described in the Talmud in the story about the creation of the golem, right? And here he is able to heal his comrade or even resurrect him if he's already dead, right? And so this kind of creative magic, the creation of golems, creating some kind of new entity, you see that in a variety of mystical texts, both in the Talmud, in Sefer Yetzirah, and in the literature of the Hasidei Ashkenaz. There were certain ritual objects that were believed to have the power to shield people who possessed them from harm. And the names of God, and especially the four-letter name of God, would prevent any harm from the Sitra Achra, the forces from the other side. Okay? And earlier sages believed that that name of God was very powerful, that it could both create and destroy entire worlds. So you operate with them very carefully. And we're going to see an example of that in text number 3. Let me stop for a second and take questions, comments. Anyone have any questions? Yes, Jerry. You have to unmute, Jerry.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Didn't they say that one of the tests about the Messiah is you can't believe that if somebody can do miracles, that he is a Messiah? That's one of the questions, right?
Right. He has to be able to do something specific.
Right.
The fact that he can, perform certain wonders doesn't make him the Messiah. If he can deliver, peace on earth and a just society and return the Jews to their land, then you take him a lot more seriously.
But why did they put that in there as a qualification?
Because they believed that people could do magical things.
And it wasn't just always the Jews, because like Balaam the prophet,
Yes,
he could
yes.
do that kind of stuff.
Correct. There were, non-Jews who were wonder workers too. Yeah, wasn't restricted to us. But that didn't, your ability to do that didn't mean that you were the Messiah. It just meant that you possessed special knowledge or special powers. Was much more limited. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions or comments here? Okay, so let's go back to the text and we'll see text number 3. This is from one of the great Chassidei Ashkenaz, Eliezer of Worms. And he writes, just as the name is found on the angel, so also the tefillin are found on the hand and likewise on the head. And he quotes a verse from Isaiah, with the shadow of my hands I have covered. He safeguards the righteous so that the prophet sees, so that he may know who was upon me and who safeguards me by means of the shadow of his hand. This is just as it is now on the night of Hoshana Rabbah. Everybody know what Hoshana Rabbah is? Hoshana Rabbah is the 7th day of Sukkot, right? So it's like the unofficial end of the high holiday period. It's like, on Rosh Hashanah the decree is signed, and on Yom Kippur it is sealed. But up until Hoshana Rabbah, you can have an appeal. Okay? After that, bam, it's final. Right? And it says on Hoshana Rabbah, whoever has a shadow will live. Whoever has no shadow and his head is small, without a neck, he will die within the same year. Since God then decides in relation to the amount of water for that year. And the prophet sees the glory that has been created in order that he will see in accordance with the divine will. Okay, this is a fairly obscure text. So let me just, break down a little bit of what it says, right? The tefillin are special because they contain God's name, right? And they remind us of the mitzvot, of course. They spiritually tie the one who wears them to God, but they are a safeguard, right? It's the hand of God protects that person and his shadow. Okay. This is what you call preventive magic, right? Preventing harm to the person who wears them, right? Now, Sukkot, the Hoshana Rabbah is the 7th day of Sukkot. Sukkot includes many rituals and prayers for rain. In fact, the day afterwards, Shmini Atzeret, right? The 8th day of assembly after the 7 days of Sukkot is the day on which we include prayers for rain. Okay? That's kind of a fragment, a remnant of all the past practices and prayers for rain during Sukkot in ancient times. All right. So it's a Hoshana Rabbah is a big transition day. Right? Some of the Chassidei Ashkenaz believed that you could tell your fate for the coming year if you looked at your shadow on Hoshana Rabbah. Right? That is predictive magic, telling the future. And sometimes maybe, if you had someone who was a wonder worker, you could go to them and maybe do some sort of preventive magic against that, so that in order to overcome that prediction that you might die in the year ahead. There's a whole phenomenon in Judaism of the Baal Shem. Right? You all know about the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic approach to Judaism. Right? Literally, that means Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name. But Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov started out as a Baal Shem, meaning he actually wrote amulets containing God's name, using the divine name for magical purposes. Now, if someone was sick, you would put an amulet with God's name under their pillow to try to counteract the effect of the demons, so that that person would get well. Right? And if your amulets were especially effective, that was, the word about your amulets, then you became pretty well known, because more people would come to you for that. Right? And so that's why he became known. Rabbi Israel became known as Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov. Okay? We'll come to the Baal Shem Tov much later on, maybe before this spring is out. Okay? But the actual use of the term Baal Shem goes back to the writings of Rav Chai Gaon, who lived in the 10th and 11th century. There were lots and lots of Baalei Shem, amulet writers. The belief in their efficacy was quite common wherever Jews lived. It's not a big surprise to see that among the Hasidei Ashkenaz, and one of the great teachers among them, Eliezer of Worms. All right. He too was considered a renowned Baal Shem, and he wrote quite a few amulets for a variety of purposes. Okay. Comments or questions up to here? Yes, Lou.
This text refers to the night of Hoshana Rabbah and shadows, and at night the only light would be candles. Are they talking about shadows from candles or shadows from the sun?
Probably shadows from candles, or from whatever moonlight there was. You still have a pretty good moon, because the first day of Sukkot is a full moon.
You're a week off.
So by the seventh day, you have about half that. So you might have a shadow, in the moonlight. Other questions or comments? Yes, Daniel.
I have a whole bunch, but I'll just ask one.
Well, one at a time. Anyway.
Three lines from the bottom, if I remember right, there's a reference to a small head. I mean, basically what I'm understanding is that on this night at the end of Rosh Hashanah, God's going to decide how much rain's going to come for the coming year. And somehow or another, that's tied with shadows, blah, blah, blah. But where I lose it completely is what that has to do with having no neck and a small head. Mm-hmm. What are those symbols or something? What is he
probably really and this is just a guess on my part. I don't have a full answer, but my guess is that the reduction of the head symbolizes the reduction of the soul, that the process is already starting for that person's passing into another realm.
And somehow or another, that's tied with how much rain we're going to get and who's going to live and who's going to die.
Yes,
Crystal clear then.
you're right. Yes, Lou.
Does the small head and no neck refer to the shadow or the human being?
There's the shadow, right? But the shadow tells you what's going to happen in the future. The shadow is predictive magic. So, if you just get the right kind of light, you can get a better head. So keep that in mind next to Hoshana Rabbah, right?
I'll try to remember.
Good, good. We didn't have much of a Hoshana Rabbah this year, so there weren't a lot of people out looking at their shadow this year. Oh well. All right, moving along to text number 4. This is kind of a more intense example of the use of God's name from one of the mystics of Tzfat, Eliyahu Davidus. It is a terrific book from everything I've studied in it. It's really, one of those. It's like a collection of the best of the mystics, right? Of the mystic, up to the 16th century, including a few things from the 16th century, including a lot of things from the Zohar, and including a lot of what the Kabbalists in the 16th century understood to be the meaning of what they were doing. So he calls this kind of knowledge, the magical usage of God's name, practical Kabbalah, the knowledge of God's holy names, which can be permutated into a number of different forms, such as the name of 42 and the name of 72. We'll come to that in a moment. Through this name is a link to the ancestors through many paths for judgment, mercy, aid, loving kindness, awe, guidance in Torah, life, death, good or evil. Happy are the righteous who know the ways of Torah and know how to walk the path of the Torah of the Holy King. Unquote from the Zohar. And even though the truth is that it is not proper for every individual to make use of these holy names, for who is worthy to use the scepter of the king other than one who is close to the king? Right? The right knowledge in the wrong hands, right? You don't want the average person to know how to make a bomb, right? You just assume they not be able to do that. Still, we know without any doubt that one who knows how to use them and is worthy to do so can bring about wondrous things, as I have witnessed and have heard from one who did so. Okay? So when he says that he has witnessed them and heard them from one who did so, he's probably talking about Isaac Luria, who lived in that same period and who he actually studied with. Right? Now, what the names of 42 and the name and of 72? Right? What is that about? Right? You all know the 4-letter name of God, Yud, He, Vav, He. Right? If I take each letter of the Yud, He, Vav, He and write that letter out in the letters that spell those letters, I get an extended form of the name of God. So for instance, the letter Yud is spelled Yud Vav Daled. right? There are actually different spellings, which is how you get different versions of the name of God. The four-letter name, of course, is always the same, but the spelled out version gives you different, because you have different spellings for Yud, right? Or for the Hey. Sometimes Hey is spelled Hey Aleph. All right. Sometimes it's spelled Hey, Hey. Okay. Etc. Vav can be spelled Vav Aleph Vav, or just Vav Vav. Right? So if you take Yud and spell it out, right? Let's say that Yud, that it's Yud Vav Dalet. Yud is 10, Vav is 6, Dalet is 4. That adds up to 20. Right? The letter Hey, let's say that it's Hey Aleph. Hey Aleph is 5 and 1 in Gematria, right? The fifth and first letters of the alphabet. That makes 6. There are also 2 Heys in the Yud Hey Vav Hey. Okay, so that is, right, a total of 30, right? Vav, or it's just Hey, right, would be 5. Right? So you have 2 5s, that makes 10. Right? So now you have 20 plus 10. And then the Vav can be spelled Vav Vav. The Vav is the 6th letter of the alphabet. So that's 2 6s, which makes 12, which added to 30 is 42. Okay? Hence, you have a form of the 4-letter name of God, which is called the name of 42. With variant spellings, you can have other names, such as the name of 72 here. Right? The name of 72 was said to permutate the letters of 3 verses, which happen to be in this coming week's Parsha, B'Shalach, right, in Exodus 14, which tell about the splitting of the sea. Okay? And Davidus goes on to cite a tradition that it was through the use of this name that Moses performed the miracle of the splitting of the sea. Okay? Now, in Tzvat, it was just assumed that the name of God had this kind of power, right? Because letters have power. The Hebrew letters, which are the building blocks of creation, through which God created the universe, those letters have real creative power. Right? Now, again, here it's not that you can't use magic. As long as it's white magic, as long as it's magic for a positive purpose or preventive magic, then it's fine if you know how to do it. The problem is, if you don't know how to do it, then you can misuse God's name and make things even worse than they were before, right? God help you if you, misuse God's name. Then you're in serious trouble, right? So the Baal Shem is somebody who knows how to do this through the use of amulets, right? there were all kinds of miracles that people could do, and that were accepted as part of the, the realm of the holy for many centuries. So for instance, from the 10th century on, there was attestation of a phenomenon called kfitzat haderech. Kfitzat haderech literally means jumping across the way. Kfitzat haderech meant that magically a person endowed with certain holy powers could use God's name in order to cross vast distances in a very short period of time. This is like folding up the roads so that you could, cross hundreds of miles in an amazingly short time. Right? Maybe you had to get to some place in time to prevent harm to a community. Right? So the holy man had a way of getting there on time. Right? And so right into the Hasidic period in the 18th century, the Rebbes, because they were seen as holy people, and they were definitely Kabbalists, they were able to do these kinds of things frequently. They were able to perform miracles. By the way, you don't see any reference to this phenomenon after the 18th century. Why not? Because trains were invented. Right? Trains were able to do the same thing naturally. Right? So you didn't have kfitzat haderech attested to anymore. Right? Now, let's stop here for questions and comments. Yes, Lou.
This using the value of letters, is this a form of gematria?
It's exactly that. The application of numerical values to each letter. Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, Gimel is 3, etc. And gematria, was a time-honored method of giving, interpretations of biblical text. Okay. Okay. Yes, Chris. But you have to unmute yourself, Chris.
Is the mezuzah also considered an amulet at times?
It was, and in fact, the form of the mezuzah still reflects that. So if you happen to have a parchment, I don't advise you to take one out from your house and, take it out and look at it. That's a lot of trouble. But if you happen to have, or you can go online and look at a parchment that is written for a mezuzah, right? So on one side of the parchment, you will see the Shema, the Ahavta, and the paragraph afterwards, V'aya im shamoa. You know those paragraphs from Jewish liturgy. If you're familiar with the Siddur, you're pretty familiar with those prayers, okay? Because they contain the directive to place the words of Torah on the doorpost of your house and upon your gates, okay? But if you look on the reverse side, right, number one, a typical traditional mezuzah will also have the word Shaddai, right? Shaddai is a name that means God Almighty, God the All-Powerful. Similarly, by the way, on the case of the mezuzah, many mezuzah cases have a shin on the top to stand for that word, Shaddai. All right. Well, Shaddai was regarded as an acronym for the words Shomer Delatot Yisrael, guardian of the doors of Israel. So it was, at least until relatively modern times, it was seen as a protective form of magic, right? That it would show, God was Shomer Delatot Yisrael, and this amulet would protect harm from coming to the home. And if harm indeed came to the home, what would people do? They'd check the mezuzahs. They might find that there was something wrong with the mezuzah, and they'd have it fixed or put in a new parchment, correct in all of its details, and then they'd see if the problem got fixed. Now, that's the first thing that's on the back of the mezuzah. The second thing is it has some words that appear to be mumbo jumbo. Okay? They don't really mean anything in and of themselves. However, each letter in that mumbo jumbo is the letter, if you take the letters before each letter in that mumbo jumbo, it spells out the words Adonai Eloheinu Adonai. Okay? So it was kind of a transformed name of God, one that was expected to be effective at warding off evil. Okay? Now, why mezuzot are still written this way? Well, it's like some of our synagogues. Change just comes really hard. Okay? Even when we know we should change certain things, we don't always want to do it. Or some people will say, well, you never know. Or some people will say, we don't have the authority in our generation to make those changes. So the bottom line is just about any writer of mezuzahs is going to do it the old-fashioned way, even if they don't believe in magic, they're going to keep the traditional form. And that's what we do with mezuzahs. So no, a mezuzah is not really supposed to be an amulet. As Maimonides says, it's there to remind us how to live our lives, both when we see it and we go out into society, and when we see it when we come into our home. Right? That there are certain ways we should live our lives. But the idea of it being an amulet dies hard. Okay? Other questions? Yes, Jerry.
I have had two occasions in my life personally where I had some physical thing happen to my body. And the first thing we did was we took the mezuzah off the door and we found something wrong with it that was related to my physical problem. This is 2 times in my life. So I don't take it too lightly. Right?
I understand. So, you would be very hard to convince that this is just magic.
No, but the thing
or
that,
that the magic isn't effective.
well, it is effective because, when you take that mezuzah out and you start analyzing where in the Shema certain things happen, and then you find some damage. And one time I found a hole somewhere, and it had to do, it was a hole right through the vavacha, and then somebody I know had a heart attack. House.
Yeah. So, a skeptic might say, well, that's coincidental, right? But when, for many of us, I don't think we're so skeptical. We take that tradition very seriously. I'm not here to try to dissuade anybody of that. I'm not here to tell anyone that it works. I'm just saying this is how it functions in the tradition.
The second part of it is, when you buy a mezuzah, you want to make sure it's not paper,
Right.
because all bets are off then.
Right. It has to be parchment. It has to be written in a kosher way.
So why do we go to that length if it's if it's not something that's
Because we have a long-standing tradition that mezuzot are supposed to be written in the same way as a Sefer Torah, right? I mean, why do we go to that length for a Sefer Torah, which is, a whole Torah that has to be written on parchment in a particular way with every letter perfect? And if one letter is found to be wrong, we roll up that Torah and put it away, and we don't read it anymore until it's fixed. Well, the tradition is the same rules apply to tefillin and to a mezuzah. So when you buy your mezuzah at the Beth Yeshurun gift shop, they don't sell a mezuzah that is not properly written. We just don't sell it because we follow the tradition about those matters, that the mezuzah has to be written on parchment. Now, if you go to the gift shop at Beth Israel, you'll probably be able to pick up a much different and much cheaper piece of paper for your mezuzah. I would not be shocked. I wouldn't be shocked to find that they sell a traditional parchment as well.
I'm sorry, Rabbi, but could you repeat that? Because I may not have heard it correctly. Beth
If
Yeshurun.
you go to, at the gift shop at Beth Yeshurun only sells kosher mezuzot. Okay? By mezuzah, I'm only talking about the parchment,
Right.
not the case.
No, I thought you said the opposite of that. I thought you said that you could buy ones that are cheap that were printed.
No.
I
I was
misunderstood.
talking about Beth Israel.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
I'm with you. Sorry.
Because Beth Israel, they may not follow the same rules. Okay?
I'm glad I figured that. I'm glad I asked the question because I wouldn't want to go around saying Rabbi
wouldn't want
Horowitz sells we sell unkosher.
Wouldn't want you to
scrolls.
be stuck there. Yeah. Other questions or comments before we close today? Okay, so next time we are going to look at a text about another form of mystical magic, and it's called automatic writing. So if you want to look ahead at text number 5 and see what that's about, you can cheat ahead a little bit for next Sunday. All right. Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Jennifer. We will see you all next week, God willing.
Thank you very much.
Good job, Rabbi.
All right.
Thank you very much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.